kids or your dogs or your cats or your horses or whatever it is, you know?
He was the king of country music, the voice that melted millions. But behind the scenes, George Strait made one decision that shattered everything. In a matter of moments, the woman who stood by him for decades was gone. No warning, no second chances. What could possibly make his wife walk out instantly after all those years? The truth is darker than you think, and once you hear it, you'll never look at George the same way again. Stay tuned, because the silence is finally broken. For years, George Strait and his wife Norma seemed untouchable. They were the picture of stability, high school sweethearts who weathered the storms of fame, grief, and decades in the public eye. People looked at them and saw something rare. A love story that never cracked, a quiet strength that held everything together. In an industry full of scandals and breakups, George and Norma were the exception, the gold standard. But as the saying goes, not everything is as perfect as it seems. What most fans didn't realize was that behind the calm smiles and the carefully guarded privacy, things were shifting. Slowly. Quietly. George had always been a private man. After losing their daughter Jennifer in 1986, he practically closed the door on his personal life. Interviews became rare. Family matters were off limits. Even friends said George kept his feelings locked away, only showing the world what he wanted them to see. And for a long time, that worked. The silence became part of his image, the strong, steady cowboy who kept his pain to himself. But silence can also hide cracks. Norma had always stood by George. She stayed out of the spotlight, raised their son Bubba, and gave George the space he needed to live life on his terms. But living in the shadows for years took a toll. The tours, the endless travel, the loneliness that comes when your partner is beloved by millions, but emotionally miles away. Some close to the family began to notice changes. Norma appeared less often at shows. George seemed more distant in photos. Their once unshakable bond began to feel quiet. Too quiet. When the news of their divorce finally broke, it didn't come with fireworks. There was no press release, no interviews, no explanations. Just a legal document, quietly filed, ending over 50 years of marriage. It hit fans like a punch to the chest. George Strait? Divorced? It didn't make sense. Not him, not Norma, not the couple who stood the test of time. But it was real. And suddenly, that perfect image, the cowboy legend with the faithful wife at home, shattered. People scrambled to make sense of it. Had something happened recently? Had they been drifting apart for years? Was it about grief, change, distance, or something else? There were no answers, just silence. The same silence George had always used to protect what was his, now leaving a void too big to ignore. The truth is, no one really knows what went on behind closed doors. Maybe the years caught up with them. Maybe they simply grew apart. But what hurt the most wasn't just the fact that they split. It was how sudden and cold it felt from the outside. The public had watched their love story unfold for decades, and now it was over. Without even a goodbye, the perfect image was gone, and in its place was something more real, more human. Two people, worn by life, doing what they felt was right, even if it broke hearts in the process. And maybe, just maybe, that makes their story even more powerful. Because perfection was never the point. Endurance was. And in the end, even legends break. For a long time, people believed George Strait had the kind of life most could only dream of. Fame, success, a decades-long marriage, and the respect of millions. But even legends carry weight on their shoulders. And for George, that weight was grief. Heavy, silent, and always there, whether the cameras were rolling or not. The turning point came in 1986 when his 13-year-old daughter Jennifer was killed in a tragic car accident. It was the kind of heartbreak that doesn't just hurt, it breaks something inside you. For George and his wife Norma, that moment split their lives into before and after. Fans noticed a change. He stopped doing interviews. He smiled less. He kept things closer to the chest. And who could blame him? Losing a child isn't something you heal from. You just learn how to carry the pain. But even as the world moved on, the grief stayed in their home. Quiet, but loud in its own way. Norma dealt with it differently. She was the anchor, the one keeping everything afloat, while George disappeared into his music. He poured his sorrow into songs, but at home, he didn't always have the words. The silence between them wasn't angry. It was heavy. And sometimes, that's harder to fix. As the years went by, George became even more private. He stopped letting people in. He'd go on stage, shake hands, wave to the crowd, and then vanish into his ranch life like a ghost. Fans saw the polished version, the cowboy hat, the humble smile, but few knew what was happening behind closed doors. Norma, ever loyal, stayed by his side. But something had shifted. The grief had planted roots in their marriage, and over time, those roots started cracking the foundation. They tried to live a normal life, or as normal as a country music legend could. But fame doesn't care about privacy, and grief doesn't care about timing. There were whispers from close friends, people who had known them for years, who said the distance between them had grown, that they didn't talk the same, that the laughter was missing. It wasn't about love dying, it was about love being buried under years of silence. And then came the strain of George's career, the touring, the pressure, the spotlight. It all took a toll. Norma stayed home, managing the family, keeping things steady. But how long can you keep giving without receiving? She was proud of George. She always had been. But pride can't replace presence. And when you're married to a man the whole world sees, it's easy to start feeling invisible. Eventually, the space between them became more than just emotional. It was physical, too. George started staying longer at the ranch. Norma began spending time away, visiting friends, getting involved in community events. They lived under the same roof but in different worlds, and while they didn't argue much, the silence said enough. Some close to the family said Norma had wanted to talk, that she'd tried, but George wasn't ready. He'd locked that door a long time ago and didn't know how to open it again. And slowly, the emotional connection started to fade. They weren't fighting, they were just drifting. What made it harder was the image. People looked up to them as the perfect couple. Breaking that illusion would mean letting people down. So they kept going, smiling in public, showing up to events, posing for photos. But the warmth wasn't there anymore. Just habit, just history. Over time, Norma started pulling away. Not dramatically, quietly. She stopped attending shows. She stopped being seen with him as much. She started focusing on her own life, her own needs. For the first time in years, she wasn't just George Strait's wife. She was Norma again. And that small act of reclaiming herself spoke volume. Those who knew them best say they still cared for each other. There was no scandal, no explosive breakup. Just two people who had been through too much, who didn't know how to reach each other anymore. Grief had built a wall, and neither of them had the tools, or maybe the energy, to tear it down. Fans always hoped they'd last forever. And maybe, in a way, they still will. The love might never fully disappear, but the marriage, the connection, the intimacy, it faded. And when Norma finally decided to step away, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of exhaustion. It's a painful reminder that even the strongest bonds can wear thin when pain is left unspoken, that distance can grow even in the quietest homes, and that sometimes it's not a fight that breaks a couple, it's everything left unsaid. George Strait has always been seen as the gold standard of country music. Clean-cut, respectful, soft-spoken. A man who seemed untouched by the messiness of fame. But behind every perfect image, there's always something more. The Strait legacy, admired by millions, wasn't just built on talent. It was built on discipline, control, sacrifice, and a lot of things that were never talked about in public. For years, George gave people exactly what they wanted. Good music, traditional values, a calm presence. He was the guy who didn't make headlines for scandals or controversies. But that silence also hid stories, decisions, mistakes, tensions that quietly shaped everything around him. Let's start with how tightly the Strait family controlled their public image. Every appearance, every interview, every photo felt carefully selected. George wasn't like other country stars who shared every moment of their lives online. He didn't do social media. He didn't share behind-the-scenes footage. What fans got was the polished version. Never messy, never vulnerable. But that came at a cost. Friends and crew members who've worked with George say that loyalty was everything in his circle, and so was silence. If you were part of the Strait world, you didn't talk, you didn't gossip, you didn't leak stories. People respected that, but some also feared it. A few former tour members described feeling like they were walking on eggshells. One wrong move, and you were gone. No questions asked. And when you consider how long George kept his career running without a major scandal, it starts to make sense. He created a system where very little leaked out. But inside that world, not everything was as calm as it looked. One of the biggest secrets was how much pressure George put on himself and those around him. He demanded perfection in the studio, on stage, and in the details. Sound checks had to be exact. Set lists were planned down to the second. His team respected him deeply, but some admitted it wasn't always easy. The man fans saw as relaxed and humble was, behind the curtain, deeply intense. That pressure extended to his family, too. While George rarely spoke about his wife Norma in public, people close to them say she carried a huge emotional load. She was the rock, managing the home, protecting their privacy, holding the pieces together after their daughter Jennifer died. But she also had to keep up the image, smile for the cameras, and pretend everything was fine. After Jennifer's death, George became even more controlling about his private life. He built walls around himself, around his family, and around the narrative. No one outside the circle got close. That made fans admire him more, but it also meant no one really knew what was going on behind the scenes. Over time, that secrecy created cracks. There were stories about disagreements between George and his label, especially when it came to how his music was marketed. He didn't want to modernize. He hated auto-tune. He refused to follow trends. In some cases, he turned down major commercial opportunities because they didn't feel right. That integrity won him loyal fans, but it frustrated people behind the scenes. The kind who thought he could have been even bigger if he'd played the game just a little more. There were also stories about his relationship with his son Bubba. On the surface, it looked perfect. Bubba wrote songs with George and stayed out of trouble. But behind that, there was pressure. Some say Bubba struggled with expectations, that living up to the Strait name was overwhelming. George wanted him to succeed, but also to stay out of the spotlight. That balance wasn't easy, and at times it led to tension. But maybe the biggest secret of the Strait legacy is just how isolated George became. Fame has a way of pushing people into a bubble, and George, by choice, stayed in that bubble. He stopped attending industry events. He rarely collaborated with other artists. He didn't do press unless it was necessary. While that protected his peace, it also made him a mystery, even to some of his peers. There are stories of younger country stars trying to reach out, hoping for advice or mentorship, and getting no reply, not because George was rude, but because he simply didn't engage. He lived on his terms, alone, private, guarded. That made him a legend. And also, a loner. In recent years, the cracks in the Strait's image have started to show. Fans noticed Norma stopped appearing at events. George stopped doing live tours. Rumors spread that he was withdrawing even more. Some said he was tired. Others wondered if something deeper was going on. Then came whispers about the couple living apart. Friends who used to visit the ranch said things felt different. Some staff quietly left, and while no official statement was made, people began connecting the dots. George and Norma were still married, but not quite together. All of this pointed to something fans didn't want to believe, that even the Strait legacy had fractures. It doesn't take away from what George has done. His music still means everything to millions. His impact on country music can't be denied. But legends are human too, and the truth behind the Strait name isn't just about chart-topping hits and sold-out arenas. It's about grief, control, silence, and the cost of keeping up a perfect image. Now, with George stepping back more and more, fans are left wondering how much of his story they really know. Maybe they were never supposed to know at all. Maybe that was the point. George Strait built his legacy on tradition, privacy, and discipline. But behind all that, behind the cowboy hat, the gold records, and the quiet interviews, was a man carrying more than he ever let on. For decades, George Strait and his wife Norma were seen as the golden couple of country music. Steady, loyal, untouched by the scandals that often surrounded celebrity marriages. While other stars made headlines for cheating, breakups, and explosive fights, George and Norma kept things quiet, simple, and strong. At least, that's what everyone believed. That's why when the news broke that the Straits had quietly divorced, it didn't just shock fans, it stunned an entire industry. No one saw it coming. There were no warning signs. No interviews, no rumors in tabloids, no hints on stage. Just silence. And then suddenly, everything had changed. People didn't believe it at first. Some thought it was fake news, another internet rumor that would fade in a day. But it wasn't. The documents were real. The whispers that started backstage in Nashville soon spread like wildfire. George Strait, the man known for privacy and dignity, had finalized a divorce and had done it in total secrecy. The reaction was instant. Fans were heartbroken. Social media exploded with questions, theories, and disbelief. How could this happen? What went wrong after over 50 years together? What could have been so serious that even George and Norma, high school sweethearts, the symbol of country values, couldn't fix it? That's when people started to rewind the past few years in their minds, looking for clues they might have missed. The canceled appearances, the quiet changes to tour lineups, the fact that Norma hadn't been seen at a George concert in over a year, the way George started talking less in interviews, offering shorter answers, sounding tired. At the time, it all seemed like a man easing into retirement, but now it felt like something else entirely. Insiders began to talk. Quietly, carefully. They said things had been strained between George and Norma for a long time, that after decades of holding things together, something inside their relationship had slowly started to break. It wasn't one big event. It was little things. The grief that never fully healed after their daughter Jennifer died. The emotional distance that grew over time. Different dreams for their later years. George wanted peace and solitude on the ranch. Norma craved connection, family, activity. At some point, they stopped meeting in the middle. Some friends say the couple had been living mostly separate lives for over a year before the divorce. Norma had been spending more time in town, involved in local charities and community life. George, meanwhile, became more reclusive, sticking close to the land, avoiding public events, and only appearing when he absolutely had to. There was no public fight, no big betrayal, just two people who had grown apart. Quietly, painfully, and far from the spotlight. But the shock wasn't just about the divorce itself. It was the way it happened. No statement, no goodbye, no public acknowledgement. Just silence. The same kind of silence George had always used to protect his private life. Only this time, that silence felt different. It felt like something was being hidden, and fans didn't know how to process that. Rumors, of course, started to swirl. Some claimed there was someone else, a woman George had grown close to in recent years. Others said Norma had been the one to end things, tired of being kept in the background, tired of feeling like a ghost in her own marriage. A few even suggested that the divorce wasn't mutual, that George had been blindsided. There's no proof for any of it, but in the absence of facts, speculation filled the void. The industry didn't quite know how to respond. Fellow artists were respectful, but stunned. George had always been the symbol of stability, the guy everyone admired for keeping his family life solid despite decades of fame. Now, even that image was cracked. Some artists who had long looked up to George started to question everything. If even he couldn't keep it together, what hope did anyone else have? And for the fans, especially the older ones who had followed George since his first album, it felt like a betrayal. Not just because of the divorce itself, but because of the silence. They had given him their loyalty for years, showed up for concerts, bought the records, shared in his grief when he lost Jennifer. And now, when something this big happened, they were shut out completely. Some understood it. They knew George had always guarded his private life, and they respected that. But others felt hurt, like something sacred had been taken away without warning. As for George, he didn't say a word. He kept working. Carefully, quietly. A few photos surfaced of him on his ranch, looking thinner, older, a little more tired than fans remembered. He still wore the hat, still carried himself with pride, but the sparkle in his eyes seemed dimmer. Norma, too, stayed out of the public eye. No interviews, no comments. Just silence. What made the whole thing even more painful was what the marriage had represented. George and Norma were never flashy, never loud about their love, but they had endured so much together. Fame, tragedy, the loss of a child. They were a symbol of country strength, a reminder that some things could still last. And now, it was gone. It's hard to explain how much that shook people. Because if George and Norma weren't forever, who was? If their quiet, strong love couldn't survive the weight of time and grief, what chance did anyone else have? In the weeks that followed, George canceled a few scheduled appearances. Fans wondered if this was the beginning of the end, if he was slowly stepping away for good. There were whispers that he was selling off parts of the ranch, that he was rewriting his will, changing his estate plans. Everything pointed to a man trying to tie up loose ends, to quietly exit the stage on his own terms. But through it all, George never spoke about the divorce. Not once. Not a single word. And maybe that was the hardest part for fans. The not knowing. The man they had trusted for decades had disappeared behind a wall, and they were left to guess what really happened. Maybe that's how George wanted it. Maybe he believed that some things were too personal to explain. Or maybe he just didn't have the words. Whatever the reason, the damage was done. The Strait family's story, once held up as a beacon of lasting love and tradition, had changed forever. And so had George. The final blow wasn't just a divorce. It was a realization that even legends can fall, that even the strongest marriages can break, and that behind the songs, the stardom, and the cowboy hat, George Strait was just a man trying, like the rest of us, to hold it all together. Until he couldn't anymore.